This is a follow-up to our big announcement from a few weeks ago on ESOP and employee ownership. And today we want to give you a little bit of background on what ESOPs are and where they came from, but also get into some of the mechanics on how they work. All right, well, we'll jump right in. So what is an ESOP? In short, it is a qualified retirement plan, and that's important for you to understand. So it is regulated, much like a 401k, where IRS, ERISA, Department of Labor, all of them kind of have their hands in how these laws and how these rules are set up. But the great part about this ESOP is that it is your participation in the company and the value of the company as we grow, as we move forward, and it comes at no cost to you. So no one has to write a check or make a payment to buy any stock of the company. You are going to get the benefit of those company shares of stock over time in your ESOP account, and we're going to explain a little bit about how that works. Also, there are no changes to any of our other existing benefit plans. So the 401k, which is also a qualified retirement plan, is going to stay intact. So if you participate in that and you receive the company match, that will continue. We do see, as we research this, there are a lot of companies that form ESOPs and then they do away with their 401k because an ESOP and a 401k are both retirement plans. We didn't want to do that. So we want you to have the ability to grow both sides of that equation if you choose to participate in the 401k. And you'll see when we get into some of the numbers that loyalty and longevity are going to be rewarded. And that's really a function of stock price over time that I'll get into in just a little bit. All right, so history lesson. The concept of an ESOP and employee ownership really came from this economist, Louis Kelso, who actually grew up in Colorado back in the Great Depression, but it was really in the 70s where the concept of employee ownership started to take off. And it was his ideas that really were the pioneering background for ESOP laws and regulations. And he was a capitalist, very much believed in American capitalism, but his philosophy was he felt like capitalism was too narrowly shared amongst business owners. And so his concepts were, let's create a broader base of capitalism, and this employee ownership model was a way that he came up with to do that, to share this capitalism with employees who work for being invested in the companies they work for. So he is considered to be the guru, the inventor of the ESOPs. The next slide. Russell Long was also instrumental in formation of ESOP law. Russell was a Louisiana senator back in the 70s. He and Kelso met, and Kelso began over time explaining his concepts of employee ownership to Russell, and Russell really liked what he heard. And so Russell, being the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, had a lot of clout in Washington, so he took Kelso's ideas to Congress. And eventually in 1974, this ERISA Act, which ERISA stands for Employment Retirement Income Security Act, that law was passed, and that put ESOPs on the map. So 1974. So ESOPs have been around for over 40 years. And then over time, there have been other revisions to the ESOP laws that have allowed for additional tax incentives for business owners looking at ESOPs as a way to transition ownership in their companies. And I'll talk a little bit more about those tax incentives. Here are a few company logos that you can see, and I'm sure you recognize at least a few of these. These are ESOP-owned companies. And it's kind of a neat thing. You see and you learn Cliff Bar, that's an ESOP-owned company. It just makes you want to support those employee-owned companies. I know when my wife saw this list, she wanted to buy a new pair of shoes. Those of you who don't know, Dansko is a shoe company. I said, well, why don't you just go buy Cliff Bar? It's a little cheaper. But anyway, it just makes you want to support those companies. There are about 10,000 U.S. companies that are ESOP owned, and about 40% of those are 100% employee owned. And that's important to understand the distinction. Envision is now 100% owned by the ESOP. There are corporations that sell to ESOPs, and they sell portions of stock, 30%, 50%, 70%. And then in many cases, they'll come in years down the road and sell more of their company to the ESOP. I've met several businesses and owners that have done that over the last year as I've networked. But Envision decided, let's just do it all at one time, just given where we are in our history and where we think we're going in the future. We just felt like that was the right thing to do. And then you can see over 10 million employees work for those 10,000 ESOP-owned companies. So a pretty wide base of employee ownership in the United States. And this slide just depicts that as well. You can see every state is represented by a corporation that is headquartered in that state that is ESOP owned. So in the 40 plus years ESOPs have been around, there has been good widespread use of those laws in creating these employee-owned corporations. So that's a little bit about the background. I'm going to hand it over to Lori, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the features of ESOPs.
So we wanted to pull some statistics from a recent study of similar companies and the impact that ESOPs have made for employees. The first stat is employees at ESOP companies have 2.5 times greater retirement accounts, which makes sense. As Jeff mentioned, we have the opportunity to continue to participate in our 401k plan, plus the benefits that we'll have through the ESOP. And so it makes sense that we would have greater retirement accounts. Additional information, ESOP companies have 25% more, are 25% more likely to stay in business, and employee owners were 4 times less likely to be laid off during the recent recession. I like this stat. Productivity improves by 4 to 5% on average in the year an ESOP is adopted. Anybody have any idea why that is?
We're in charge of our own destiny.
There you go. Yeah, it certainly is motivating, isn't it, when you can see the direct results of your work tying into your retirement account. And then over a 10-year period, ESOPs have 25% higher job growth than comparable companies without an ESOP. So obviously, with that productivity, the company's growing, we have more jobs to offer.
So I wanted to talk just briefly about, and I've got the question up here, if the ESOP did not own Envision, who would? And every privately held business has a life cycle to it. And at some point, the owners make the decision that it's time to sell the business. And this pie chart represents, it's a snapshot of 2015 data, privately held businesses and who they sold to, those owners. And the 2 largest pieces of that pie that represent 94% are what I would consider just your typical strategic buyer, where a business sells to a larger corporation that's looking to consolidate, or a competitor potentially in the industry. So you can see that is by and large what most privately held businesses do. And I will say the Envision ownership group has been approached many times over the years, but more recently, about 16, 18 months ago, we did have a large competitor, one that's a little bit larger than us, approach us, wanted to know if we were interested in selling the company. And their footprint is not in the regions that we are in, so we would have complemented their business very well. We agreed to meet with them, so we did. And after that meeting, it really triggered a lot of thinking on the Envision owner's part. And we ended those conversations pretty quickly. It didn't go very far, but it just got us thinking about, okay, what does that look like and what does that mean? And when a business owner sells a business, there's a lot of risk involved in that. And to think about, and what we thought about is, okay, 18 years of history and the culture and the legacy to some extent of what has been built, the risk of that continuing is huge. If you sell to another company, they may say all the right things culturally that they do, but you just never know when you're not in charge anymore. And so that was very bothersome to us as we kind of weighed those options, and especially for our employees and teams that we have here in Colorado Springs. It could have been very detrimental to you and your families, because larger companies headquartered somewhere else, and it's likely that they're going to want to pull the finance and HR and all those functions to their corporate office. And so the thought of having a large team of ours potentially lose their jobs was just more than we could stomach. And so we got off of that, and it was, I think, divine intervention. It was within a few weeks of us ending those conversations, somebody introduced us to this concept of an ESOP. And so we started getting educated, and that's where it kind of really took off. But the thinner slices of this pie chart, you can see the red is an IPO, and that's when a privately held business goes public and starts selling their stock on the NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange. And when you do that, there's all kinds of regulation that now come into play, and you now have shareholders that are very concerned about stock price and quarterly earnings, and in our opinion, running a business that is publicly traded becomes much more of a focus on how's the stock price and what are we doing this quarter than it does what are we preparing for 5 years from now. And that just is not something that we wanted to do. The other 1% sliver there is ESOP adoption. So in 2015, 1% of business owners actually sold their companies to an ESOP plan for the benefit of their employees. So even though there's 10,000 of us in the country, it's still a very, very small percentage of ownership transitions for corporate America. And one of the advantages to an ESOP is now Envision now has an ownership structure that can continue in perpetuity. Much like a publicly traded company, you don't have now another owner that bought Envision that may be looking to do something else in 5 years. Now, with an ESOP, it can continue. So you guys participate today, employees that we hire 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, they will be able to participate in this as well. And so it can just continue and not have to worry about those life cycles of a business. I've touched on these, just wanted to bullet point some of the advantages. Obviously, the maintaining that culture and legacy that's been built. Many of you have been with us for many, many years and have played a huge role in building that culture and building that legacy. So to be able to see that continue, and that business continuity, no disruption of what you guys see and do every day and how the company is run, none of that is disrupted at all. And then obviously your engagement now as an employee owner is different. We already have and have had a very strong culture in our employee base, and what you guys do every day and what's done in our centers, we have a very high bar already and a high level of performance. But to add this on top of it, I think is just going to propel us even further. And then obviously you now have skin in the game. So you have a personal stake in our results and how well we do in the future. I mentioned earlier there are some tax advantages, and I'll speak to the main one for a few minutes here. And I think it's not as important now, but I think as we move throughout and mature as an ESOP, it will become a great advantage for Envision. As 100% owned by an ESOP, Envision is no longer a income tax paying corporation, and that's one of the tax law benefits. So all of the earnings that Envision produces, we no longer have to pay income taxes like we did in the past. So 30 to 40% of our earnings were going to Uncle Sam. The way that works with the tax laws is because the ownership resides now in this qualified retirement plan. You guys will participate in that, and your individual accounts will grow, tax deferred, is what I like to call it, just like your 401k. When your 401k grows in value, you don't have to pay tax on that year. When you pay tax on that is when you retire and you start to pull money out of it. Well, that's the same way an ESOP works. So the value and the earnings and what's being built in Envision will end up in your accounts, and the taxes will be paid by you individually when you draw them out in retirement. And so that's how the tax engine works. But where that'll be a huge advantage is, say, 8-10 years from now, Envision is a very strong cash flow company already, but now with an extra 30 or 40% of cash flow, what we can do from an acquisition and growth standpoint, when you compare our ability to maybe gain leverage with financing versus our competitors, looking at acquisitions, we will have a very competitive advantage in those acquisitions and that growth. So those are just a few of the benefits. We could have listed a couple of different slides there of those. We wanted to share with you a video that was put on by the NCO, and those that picked up the booklets, that booklet was published by the NCO, and that is an organization that stands for National Center for Employee Ownership. Envision is now a member of that. I've already been to several of their conferences, networking with other employee-owned companies, sharing ideas, so it's a great organization. But this one we thought was great to share with you. It's just a few minutes here.
I am a true believer of employee owners and employee ownership and ESOPs and what they can do for companies, what they can do for the individual employees. And I think what's less well known is what it can do for communities.
Everyone is aware that we have a wealth disparity problem in this country. And ESOPs are the obvious solution.
We had a young lady that came to work for us, and she was there at the inception of the ESOP. And I think she was probably 23 or 24, and she had her bachelor's degree and then had moved back home to Truckee because of the debt that she'd accrued. And she worked for us for 7 or 8 years and paid off all that debt. And it was always her goal to become a teacher. So once she had the debt paid off, she went down to San Francisco and used her distribution to fund her master's. And now she's a professor at San Francisco City College, which is just a cool deal. I mean, that's life-changing.
Some employees who have been able to put their children through college, been able to help pay their bills, etc. Because generally speaking, employee-owned companies do provide better wages and benefits than non-employee-owned companies, and I think we're one of those.
I see a lot of young people who come to work for us within a couple few years, they're starting their families. And that takes a measure of confidence to say, yes, I'm ready, I'm willing to start a family now. That's a huge expense, and it takes a certain amount of stability in your personal and professional life for that to be the right choice at that time.
We have about 130 employees now, and I look at all of those employees as our shareholders. Every one of our employees understands the business. They know the direction we're going. That's really refreshing for me, and that's exciting, and that makes it easy.
ESOPs are a very powerful way to preserve both the independence and the culture of something that a founder has built.
We have so many great benefits at Odell Brewing. If somebody is willing to take advantage of the 401k, and then on top of that, we're also giving them employee ownership, equity in the company, we are giving people a chance to actually retire. And I think you have to look across our country. There are millions of people who don't even understand how they could begin to approach retirement. We are giving access to that to everybody in our company. I mean, that is mind-blowing to look at everybody in our company and say, you know what, you actually, if you are diligent, you have a shot at this. You could be successful in retirement.
Pretty cool, huh? We're going to transition into some of the mechanical pieces of an ESOP and how they work. And I will say, because of the regulation that's involved, there weren't very many options as we looked at plan design and how to set this up. It was pretty much, in a lot of areas, dictated this is how you have to do it. But there were a few places that we'll highlight where we had some options in plan design. But I'm going to let Lori tackle eligibility first.
So one of the first questions I'm sure everybody has is, how do I begin to participate? And the good news for all of us that are at least 21 years of age and were employed with Envision Radiology on December 31st, 2017, you became an eligible participant in the plan. So that's the good news. Moving forward in 2018, individuals will become eligible. Again, you must be 21 years of age, and that's an ERISA rule that goes across a lot of different types of plans like this. And then also completing 1,000 hours of service within the plan year. Our plan year runs consistent with the calendar year from January 1 to December 31st. And so a typical 40-hour-a-week person will have worked 2,080 hours in a year. So you can use that as a judge to determine, what 1,000 hours of service looks like. So a little less than half time. There are specific rules surrounding those individuals that start later in the year, and their 1,000 hours of service track over the plan year. So if you start in November, you obviously aren't going to have time to work 1,000 hours by December 31st. So we'll help individuals determine their eligibility date as those dates come along. So at the end of each plan year, the plan will make a contribution, or the company will make a contribution to our ESOP. And Jeff's going to talk about the calculation that is used to determine your portion and the shares that are distributed to you.
All right, so this gets into the weeds a little bit, but we always like to be transparent. So I'm going to attempt to describe how shares actually end up in your individual account. So if you have that level of curiosity, stay with me. If you don't, you can check out for a couple minutes, and I'm okay with that. But you have to think of it, there's two allocation formulas that drive the end result of getting shares into your individual account. The first calculation is this contribution, which drives this release of what's called the suspense stock or suspense shares in the company. And this is driven by a couple of different factors. One is ERISA guidelines specify there is a benefit level maximum that can be contributed from an employer to an employee into a qualified retirement plan. Right now, that benefit maximum is 25%. And where that comes into play here is if you look at all eligible payroll across Envision, and it's somewhere close to $40 million, so just use that number in your head. 25% of $40 million is $10 million. So that maximum rule says in any given year, the employer cannot contribute more than $10 million of value into that ESOP or that benefit plan. And so that drives some of the formulas that determine how much contribution can be made. Second factor that drives that, in our case, when you have what's called a leveraged ESOP, and leveraged is just a fancy word for debt. When you have a leveraged ESOP, there is repayments on loans that determine how much that contribution is. And think of it this way. If you think of the benefit plan or the ESOP as a separate entity from Envision, the way this whole transaction happened last month when we closed this is that the company, with its strength in earnings and balance sheet, went out and borrowed money from a bank and borrowed money from the founding shareholders. That money was then loaned to the benefit plan. The benefit plan turned around and used that money to buy the stock. So how confusing is that? That is how the transaction works, and that's how the regulations allow for that to happen. So what the end result of that is the company now owes money to a bank and owes money to the founding shareholders, and the plan owes money to the company. So there's two different levels of debt there, and the one between the plan and the company is what we call the internal loan, and that's just ESOP terminology. and it's that benefit max, 25%, drives the loan period amortization of how long is it going to take for the plan to pay off that debt, because the contribution that's made from the company underneath that 25% cap is going to turn right around and pay off that debt. And so that's the rules that govern how much can be contributed each year into the ESOP, which determines then how many shares get released out of suspense. So that's the first level of allocation that I just described to you. You ready for the second? Again, this took me 6 months to learn, so I know it's a lot to absorb. So the second level is the one you're most interested in. Well, how does it get from the plan into my account? And that one's actually a little bit easier to follow. That is simply for that given year what your total compensation, and if you're hourly, it's wage plus overtime, it's your total W-2 for that year, divided by that total eligible compensation, which is somewhere between 35 and 40 million. That gets a percentage, and then that percentage is multiplied times those number of shares that got released from the suspense account. And that the product of that formula is the number of shares that you would receive in your account for that year. So my example here in parentheses in this bullet point is assuming that this contribution formula resulted in 2,500 shares being released from suspense. And let's say in my hypothetical that we've got an employee that makes $75,000 in total comp for that year, and for math it's 35 million, so you divide 75,000 into the 35 million for that year times 2,500 shares equals my hypothetical 5.35 shares for that 1 year for that one employee into their account. So that is the main mechanism by how shares end up in your individual account. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about how that gets valued and how you see that and how you participate in that. Lori's going to talk a little bit more about one other method of you receiving shares.
So you can also get an allocation of shares through forfeitures. So in order to, you can switch to the next slide. In order to understand forfeitures, we need to look at our vesting schedule. So our vesting schedule with our 401k plan at Envision is so generous. As many of you are aware, you are 100% vested when you become eligible for our 401k plan. That's quite unique. Usually 401k plans follow a vesting schedule, much like the one listed here, which is the vesting schedule that our ESOP plan will follow. And that is 2 years of service. You will become 20% vested. And then your vesting will grow 20% every year thereafter. So at 6 years of service, you are 100% vested. Does everybody understand what vesting means? Essentially, vesting means if you were to leave the organization, how much of those shares of that value would you be able to take with you? And that percentage grows over time. Another really cool thing that should be mentioned is the vesting schedule does not start at the date that the ESOP was created. This is one choice. There weren't a lot of choices that the owners could make in just some of these plan designs for the ESOP, but one opportunity they did have to make a choice had to do with when this vesting schedule would begin. And the owners did decide to go ahead and recognize previous service. So if you are an individual that has already worked for Envision for 6 years, you are already 100% vested, which is awesome, right? So yeah, this goes by date of hire, not date of not years of service since the development of the ESOP. So really good point. Good news for us all. So what happens when an individual leaves, though, and they've had those shares allocated to them, and they've only been with they only have 3 years of service? That individual is 40% vested, so 60% of those funds are forfeited, or those shares are forfeited, and then the other individuals in the plan would receive those shares would be redistributed to the other members of the ESOP plan. So that is another way that shares could be allocated to you. It's important to note, too, that if you were to become disabled or in the event of your death, shares would be allocated to your beneficiaries. Or if you reached normal retirement age of 65, in all of those cases, your vesting level would escalate to 100% automatically. This is just a overall org chart of our organization, and we thought we would provide this just as a visual to kind of understand really what our company involves. Now the ESOP is the top tier of this organizational chart, meaning we are all owners. That's our ownership.
Can I highlight a couple of things from this one? So it's important also to note that the ESOP participation is at the parent level, and this is the same for all employees of Envision. So our employees in Texas, that their paychecks used to be from this entity, and late last year we moved their paychecks to this entity so that they could share in this. So everyone participates at the same level. So if we come out here and do a new joint venture in Salt Lake City or other places, and we got a lot of irons in the fire right now of development, all of that activity will roll up and be shared in this ESOP. So your partners in Texas and in Denver share at the same level that you do in this ESOP.
Great. So let's see. How is the value of my ESOP account determined? We just wanted to point out and let you know that there is a method that you'll be able to track your value. You will receive an annual statement that provides you an accounting of your beginning balance at the beginning of that plan year, any credits that were made, any allocations that were made to your account. So that would be that annual calculation, that annual allocation of shares, along with any forfeitures that were also allocated to your account. And then you'll have that ending balance to give you an idea of where you're at and how your account is growing. In that statement as well, it will include your individual vesting level.
And just one thing to point out here, there is an independent valuation that's done every year on Envision. So because we're not publicly traded, we don't know what our stock price is. Like Apple and Google, they can just look at the stock market and see. So we have to, and there's a trustee, I'll talk a little bit more about what the trustee's role is later, but that trustee hires an independent valuation firm. They come in and do a valuation of the business, and that produces what that year's stock price is, which will then in turn drive the value of the account that you're going to see on that annual statement.
So how do you receive the value of your ESOP account? So that's kind of where we're all at, right? How do I actually receive the value of my account? So at termination, in a situation where you've reached normal retirement age, or again, we've talked about if you become disabled, or if you pass away going to your beneficiaries, you will become 100% vested. And the distribution of those funds will happen in equal payments over a 5-year period, beginning 1 year after your termination date. In the event that, say you have to relocate and you are not able to continue your employment with Envision and you resign, or if an individual is dismissed, that participant will be vested according to the vesting schedule that we talked about earlier, and their distribution would occur in equal payments as well over a 5-year period. However, that distribution will start in the 6th year after their termination. This right now, that longer distribution period or that waiting period was set up essentially as a new ESOP to really protect the plan itself. If we have too many distributions early on, that could be detrimental to the plan. There is some thought that we will be able to shorten that waiting period as the ESOP plan matures and develops. We've mentioned this a bit about the fact that these plans are tax deferred. So we really want to point out the fact that as you are allocated or these funds are distributed to you, it's important that you remember that it is in a tax-deferred setting right now, and you would more than likely want to transfer those allocations into another tax-deferred type of account, so an IRA. If you were to take these shares and take them in their cash value and basically cash them out, you would be subject to paying taxes on that income, and then depending on your age, could also face some tax penalties. So that would require some planning on your part to make sure you maintain those funds in a tax-deferred account.
So obviously the woman in the video that we just saw that took it out and had kind of a change of life and went back to school, she paid taxes on that distribution so that she could get to those funds and use them for her education.
And likely with her age, she's probably in a situation where she also probably had to pay some tax penalty. So that obviously, but for her life, that may have made sense. That provided her opportunity, and that was worth it to her. But it's a choice definitely that needs to be considered.
All right, so I'm going to get back into some numbers. And I know this is really hard to see for those of you in the back especially. But I wanted to just give you an example to show the relationship between company value, debt, and stock price. Because I think this really, if this sinks in, you can understand what the next few years might look like in terms of that stock price that you're going to see on your statement. And these are all hypothetical numbers in a chart that I put together just to help you grasp the concept. So in my example, I'm using a $200,000 value. And I've said in other presentations, you can also think of this as a house, that you're buying a house worth $200,000 with a mortgage. And in my example, that mortgage or that debt is going to be paid off over 10 years at 5% interest per year, which I've calculated what those payments and those balances are. And because I need to get it to a stock value or share value, I've just assumed 100 shares outstanding, and let's just say there's 100 owners that have one share each for purposes of this calculation. And so at the beginning of that transaction, when that $200,000 house or business is bought with $200,000 worth of debt, there's no equity value at the beginning, right? So there's zero equity value. But as you move along in time, and these are years across the bottom of the graph, you can see that at the end of year one, that $200,000 mortgage has been paid down to $184,000, and the house, in the house example, has grown. I forgot to mention that it's growing at a modest 3% per year. So the value of the house has now gone up to $206,000. So now in 1 year, you've created equity of just under $22,000. You divide that by these 100 shares outstanding, and you get a stock price at the end of year one of $218. As you move throughout these years, you can see the dynamic of a growing house value or company value and a reduction in debt plays a huge factor in what this stock price does, and you can see it jumping very quickly. And I will say that these two pieces, Envision has never had a year where we didn't grow less than 10%. And so 3% is very modest given our history. And we think with the debt that was taken on to do this ESOP transaction, we actually have projected and are hopeful that we'll have it paid off in 8 years, maybe 9 years. And so this relationship should ring true for us on a conservative scale. But if you look at that $200 stock price at the end of year one, by the end of year 5 is almost 6 times that. 5.5 times what it started year one. It's almost $1,200 at the end of year 5, even though the company's value has only grown by $30,000 in my hypothetical example. So if you think about that dynamic with Envision now paying this debt off and continuing to grow, those early years, the stock price is going to be a little depressed because of the debt that was taken on. But if you hang on, you're going to see a very quick rise in that stock price as we really accelerate that debt payment. And so, those first few years, you're going to get that statement that's going to say, this is how many shares are in my account, and this is the value of those shares. In those first few years, you're not going to take it home to your spouse and say, hey, we can retire. It's just not going to work that way. But if you hang on for several years, remember that first slide where we said longevity is rewarded, those shares that you got in year one, those aren't going to be taken away from you unless you leave and you're not vested. Those are your shares. So those same shares you got in year one, by the time you get out here to year 5, are worth 5.5 times what they were the first year. Plus you got more shares allocated to you each year. So you can see how this compounds on itself very quickly. And that's the concept I want you to grasp hold of. The next slide is more numbers. We asked our team of consultants that we had help us put the ESOP together. We gave them some company projections and said, we think we can grow from 34 centers to 45 centers in the next 5 years. And then beyond that, just project a very modest 3 to 4% growth and take those projections and figure out how quickly we can pay off the debt, and then show us some examples of what this might look like for our employees so that we can share that with them. So I have to, state that this is all based on projections, but we wanted to share with you some potential values. These numbers are all in thousands, so you got to add 3 zeros to these numbers. But when they ran those projections, and remember, the allocations into your account are customized based on your pay, your compensation. So we have a scale here ranging from $35,000 in comp to $100,000 in comp. And I'll just point out this $50,000 level. If that's where your compensation is close to, our projections show that by the end of year 5, you should have an ESOP account balance that's worth about 1 year's pay, about $50,000. But from year 5 to year 10, it more than triples to almost $170,000. And then in year 15, it's grown to $385,000 in value inside your ESOP account. So you think about what that means. I mean, 1,000 employees creating that kind of value for your families and your retirement, it's huge. And these numbers hopefully are going to be conservative. Hopefully we can double the size of the company in the next 7 or 8 years, and these numbers will just go off the chart. So the sky really is the limit on how much we can grow and how much value can be created. So pretty cool, huh? All right, so getting back out of the numbers, just into the legal stuff. So what else changes because of the ESOP? I mentioned earlier there's a trustee that's now involved. The board of directors for Envision hires the trustee, and that's required with the ESOPs in the Department of Labor. And that trustee's role is they are really the shareholder, because all of the stock is owned in this trust or this benefit plan, and the trustee speaks for the plan. So the trustee speaks on your behalf. So when we have our annual shareholder meeting, it's that trustee that gets to cast that vote. But their role is to just make sure that the company is doing things that are appropriate to protect the employees and the participation in the ESOP. So they do have powers because corporate law dictates that shareholders get to elect board of directors. So the former members or former owners of Envision are no longer shareholders, but they are on the board. And this was all pre-negotiated with that trustee, that the founding members will be on the board of directors. And what's unique about ESOPs is even though the trustee has power to appoint board of directors, the board of directors hires the trustee, which means they can also fire the trustee. So it's kind of a circular governance, which is a little goofy because of the ESOP rules. But the main takeaway for you guys is to know that the founding members that have been involved in all the decisions for 18 years are still there and still making those decisions and still have control of that board of directors. And for you guys, what you do day to day is not going to change. Our management structure is not changing. There's no disruption to any of that. So you will make the biggest impact as a beneficial shareholder, just doing what you do every day and helping us continue to grow the business. And I think I paraphrased all that, so you want to flip to the next one. Are there any downsides? Again, this is kind of a legal disclosure. As a business owner, you take risks. And the risk of what is the company value, what can go up and down, that is going to be there. So that account balance that you're going to see every year, there could be things completely outside of Envision's control that impact that stock price. We could be doing great, but in our industry, there could be some things going on or some Medicare regulations that causes some concern. And a lot of the valuation process is determined by what other transactions are happening in our industry. So businesses in our industry are typically sold on a multiple of earnings. And if something happens in our industry and companies are paying less than what they have been in the past, then that by itself could drive down value. Hopefully it's just a temporary thing. We go through these cycles and we see this over the years. But I just want to point out to you that there is risk involved. Now, because of that dynamic that I just showed you in that graph of the debt reduction, it's very unlikely that we're going to see any reduction in stock price until potentially we get out where the debt is completely gone and that's already baked into that stock price, and then things might fluctuate a little bit as we move forward. But while we're aggressively paying down that debt, we don't expect any reductions in stock price. I think I covered all of that. And Envision has grown because the founding owners took risk, right? I mean, we wouldn't be at 34 centers if we didn't take on risk. When we acquired the Rant centers in Texas 4 years ago, I mean, that was a $38 million transaction that had a lot of risk involved in it. So as we look and continue to grow and move forward, we're going to use the same approach in calculating what that risk is and what that return could be. And if it makes sense, we'll do it. If it doesn't, we won't. We've turned down more growth opportunities than we've actually taken advantage of in the past 15 years because we have that disciplined approach.
So how can I make an impact? I think the important thing is to just take pride in the fact that we are employee owners. We really want this to be more than just us waiting for that annual statement to come to us to see how many shares we have and what that value is, and really take this on in our day-to-day work life. We have what a great opportunity, right? I know just seeing these numbers, when we made the first announcement, I saw a lot of reactions much like my own, which was, I know this is great, I can tell it's something good, but really, what does it mean? And so it was exciting to see some of those figures and really what kind of opportunity we have here. And then to just realize that we as employee owners really can make an impact. Much like when you own your own home, when you transition from renting a home to owning your own home, it's just a different mindset. Suddenly, when you need plumbing work done, you're engaged. You want to find the best price, the best quality person to do that work. That's the type of ownership mentality that we'd like to carry on into our work life now, because it really does impact it. Us individually and us corporately to view ourselves as employee owners. So come to work every day realizing I am an employee owner, and most of all, having that carry over to, number one, our patients. Doesn't everything always come back to that? I know a lot of times in human resources, that's where we land. How is this impacting the patient? And so we can approach our care of patients, even here at the corporate offices, it still goes back to our patient care. And so that needs to be the paramount thing in our minds. And as an employee owner, we want to provide the best care possible. And then just our relationships with vendors, with our referring physician offices, we want to take care of those relationships. Working towards solutions instead of just recognizing problems. Again, as an owner, you have a different ownership mentality and making sure that problems are resolved. Performing your daily tasks like you're the best in the world, which we are, right? And so taking on that pride continuing to allow managers to manage. I know someone, after the initial announcement, we were in the break room and someone was joking and said, boy, I can't wait for that first shareholders meeting so I can cast a vote. And you know, my response was, thank goodness that that's not what this is. You know, we've had incredible leadership and we all are, you know, able to take advantage of the decision-making process, the management process that's made this company great. And I'm so happy that that process and that structure is going to remain. Our job then is to come alongside those managers and carry out the directives and decisions that are made and support that management that's established. We do have an opportunity to leverage our network and market our company. So if you have if you have friends that are you know, are having an issue and need imaging, man, you know, actively encourage them to get your scan with our company. We get to have a direct benefit from making sure that we continue to grow. So this isn't a secret. You can tell your family and your friends that you're now an employee owner of Envision Radiology. What a great opportunity, right? So we know there are a lot of questions, and questions will come up over time. So we did put together an email address that you can submit your questions to. This address actually comes to my inbox and in my Outlook, and we're gathering questions that come in from all regions of our company, and I'm bringing those questions back to Jeff, Dell, Aaron, and myself, and working with our third-party administrator, attorneys, to make sure that we provide good, accurate information. And it's important to us that as we provide responses, that we're being consistent with that, with those responses. So I'm sure that if you have a question here, there may be someone in Texas who has thought of that same question. So what our plan is, that we will take on these questions, provide the accurate answers, and send them out in an email blast sort of fashion to get everybody the same consistent information. And you may have questions that maybe somebody didn't think of, but they're like, oh, that's good information to have. So we plan on sharing those responses throughout the company. This is a new complex plan that we are all still learning about. Jeff mentioned he's worked on this plan and its development for over a year now. So we have a lot of learning to do. We're still stumped. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of our session today. You may have questions that we're not certain of. And so we have wonderful resources, though. And we will get you the answers to your questions. We just ask for your patience as we summarize these questions, get the answers back to you. So, speaking of that.
Yeah, so that's the end of our presentation. We will be, I think the next 3 weeks, we're continuing our roadshow and going to all the centers and talking to all the employees. At the end of that roadshow period, we will post this presentation on some HR platform somewhere so that you will have access to it, can sit down with your spouse and go through it, and hopefully that'll trigger even more questions and you can utilize that email address. It's up and live right now, and thank you for your time today.